I haven't quite mastered Jeff's ability to speak without any notes. That's a miracle to me, but hope springs eternal. Well, what are we to make of today's gospel reading from Matthew? This portrayal of an exchange between a Canaanite woman and Jesus is one of the most intriguing passages of the New Testament, in my opinion. So much of it is not what we expect. Here, Matthew takes Mark's earlier version of the gospel. Mark's gospel is kind of a bare bones version, and adds flesh to it and kind of upends it in surprising ways. Matthew's literary gifts take the kernel of Mark's story and shape it for mostly his audience, a mostly Jewish audience, and also for us in our time. It's helpful to remember that Matthew is writing at least 40 years after the life of Jesus, and in a time for the Jewish people when the temple had been destroyed, and basically their life as a religious community was in chaos. It's also helpful to remember that Gospels are a form of writing that go deeper than eyewitness accounts. I think in our day, we sort of have this sense that the only truth is something you can possibly see seeing it happen live, although that's debatable with our media, perhaps. Through narrative devices and the poetic power of language, gospel writers strive to convey powerful encounters with Christ. I'd like to share just 3 facets of this passage this morning. Firstly, whereas when we generally expect Jesus to be the teacher and healer at the center of each gospel story, Matthew places the faith of the Canaanite woman at the center of this story. She is the protagonist, initiating conversation with Jesus and demanding a response. This is surprising because Matthew actually describes her as a Canaanite. And I didn't know until I was researching for this that is a term borrowed from ancient history for the Israelites. It is not a current term that was used in the time of Matthew or Jesus. So Matthew is calling on his Jewish audience to recall their Jewish history and points out that and they would know in that time that any reference to the Canaanites suggests she is very much an outsider, and the Canaanites were viewed as an enemy of the house of Israel. It's also interesting because she's an outsider in another way. She's a woman in a patriarchal society where women were expected to be silent or invisible in the public sphere. Yet this woman is hardly silent. She speaks up, in fact, she shouts to get the attention of Jesus. This is the kind of courage I suspect many of us have experienced at least once, when we stand up for someone we love who is in a dire situation, and we do it despite the risks. This is the kind of love that we say can move mountains. In fact, the prophet Hosea depicts God as a ferocious mother bear who would stop at nothing to defend her own. Similarly, the Canaanite woman is ferociously persistent, approaching Jesus not once, not twice, but 3 times, each time full of trust and confidence that he will listen to her. She kneels in front of Jesus, and as churchgoers, we often see that as a symbol of penitence, but it's interesting to think that it's actually pretty darn gutsy, because if you kneel before someone, they have to walk around you to get past you. And it is the Canaanite woman's faith that shocks Jesus to move from ignoring her to see her for who she is. It is her trust in the power of love, even amid the reality of her suffering, that brings about a shift in Jesus and moves her and her daughter to healing. This story echoes that of the parable of the Good Samaritan, among others, where it is the outsider who is often the one who is clear-eyed and prophetic. Secondly, Matthew fleshes out Mark's version of this story with dialogue between the woman and Jesus. She says, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon. And Lord, help me. And again, yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. When we hear this, have mercy on me, Lord. Lord, help me. Does this form of prayer sound familiar? Anybody? With what we might say every week? We might say, answer me when I call, O God, or give ear to my words, O Lord, or have mercy upon me, O God, or as we've just said, be gracious unto us, O God, and bless us. What is this form of prayer? Anybody know? Supplication in the form of our Psalms, right? So Matthew is taking Mark's bare bones gospel and framing it in a psalm of lament so that the Jewish audience will recognize this as this form of prayer and be able to absorb it and see that we too are to be persistent in our prayer, in our questions, in our wrestling with God. It's kind of fascinating to realize that the word Israel actually means wrestling with God. In Matthew, this woman, a non-Jewish outsider, echoes back to those who dismiss her, in this case, the disciples and even Jesus, the very psalm of lament from their own tradition, so that they can see it more clearly. She even acknowledges the Jewish authority of Jesus by referring to him as Son of David. This woman's faith encourages us and is a model for us to trust in God's mercy in our trials. Not that God will perform magic tricks for us as a prize for praying, but that the practice of our prayer in the quiet center of solitude, or together as we are this morning, will open us up to the grace of God's healing in its various forms, to live more wholeheartedly amidst the chaos we might be experiencing. Thirdly, this passage calls us to reflect on Jesus as fully human and fully God. When I was young, I assumed that this meant that when Jesus was a newborn lying in the manger, he had the fully formed mind of an adult, knowing exactly how life was to unfold. But such a thing, I later learned, would mean that Jesus was not fully human. Matthew shows us the humanity of Jesus as he wrestles here with the nature of his mission, and as the Canaanite woman prompts him to be the good news and to bring it out beyond the lost sheep of Israel to the ends of the earth. Jesus was evolving and growing in his understanding of what it means to be fully human, and in that fullness, fully of God. And we are called to do the same, to grow and change and be transformed by love. The light of the gospel calls us today, in the Canaanite woman, to be bold in our love for one another, and out of that love, to pray the fervent psalms of our hearts. We are also compelled by God's grace to widen our circles, to welcome in those we might have deemed as outsiders, and to let the gospel of love live among us in all its surprising places. May it be so.